Hello. Alrighty then. Welcome to Dis and Dat um, Information, the Autonomous Collective.net. Um, Happy Tax Day, I suppose. It's the 15th of it's the 15th of April, and today we're going to tackle a somewhat longish article, and I don't know if it quite gets to the answer that it's seeking, but as far as I've gotten into it, it seems to have answered or at least addressed some questions that one needs to address, I suppose, when one is trying to figure out stuff. And two of the basic concepts that need to be sort of worked through, although I think it takes a little bit of time getting there, is on the road to sort of addressing the problem of automation. And considering the several different issues within Marx, that is the piece called Fragment on Machines, amongst others, one needs to figure out sort of um, how capitalism reproduces itself or sustains itself, and how it's important to get to a point where you can sort of say, well, is it cyclical? Is it how does it move? And how is it that we can, claim that there are laws, et cetera, et cetera? So that's kind of where we're going to go. It's, as I said, it's a fairly longish article. But first, some denotative elements. Sublation, to supersede, put an end to, but simultaneously maintain and preserve, as Lenin might say in the philosophical notebooks. For example, in the history of philosophy, a certain idea is dominant in a certain period. After a time, the idea fades in its significance, or a principle is found to be false, or the problem is resolved and attention focused on new problems. The idea of sublation is that the old idea or principle is not simply disproved and disposed of, but is contained in the new higher principle that has replaced it. As another example, in our childhood, we wrestle with certain problems which are forgotten by the time we are adults, but in fact, it is those struggles which have formed us into the adult that we now are, which is no longer troubled by those same problems. Thus, to supersede, put an end to, but simultaneously maintain and preserve. So now it's our own little struggle session. Sublation, a translation of the German word Aufheben, is a key concept of dialectics. And of course, you can see this in the shorter logic, Hegel by Hegel. Now, subsumption. Subsumption has two elements. They're going to be tackled in today's article, formal and real. Subsumption is the process by which the social relations of production penetrate the labor process itself. Marx distinguishes between the formal and real subsumption of the labor process by capital. This concept is central to how Marx conceives of how capitalism establishes itself. In the chapter In Capital on primitive accumulation, Marx showed that genuinely capitalist accumulation could only take place on the basis of productive forces and social relations, which themselves could only arise on the basis of capital. At first, capital draws into itself an existing labor process. Techniques, markets, means of production, and workers. This Marx calls formal subsumption, under which the whole labor process continues much as before, but by monopolizing the means of production and therefore the worker's means of subsistence, the capitalist compels the worker to submit to the wage labor. And by using the existing markets is able to accumulate capital. Capitalism as such, however, cannot develop on the limited basis it finds in the already existing forces of production. The prerequisites for a real capitalist labor process can only be created by capital itself. Thus, capital gradually transforms the social relations and modes of labor until they become thoroughly imbued with the nature and requirements of capital. And the labor process is really subsumed under capital. This is Marx's solution to the paradox that only capital can create the conditions for capitalist production. And, needless to say, this can be applied to certain ideas. The idea of what counts as full automation. And that's what this article today is going to sort of try to tackle. I'm not sure it necessarily gets there, although it gets us closer, perhaps, to the fully automated, luxury communism thing, if only as an idea. Devin Wangert's article, "Capitalism as a Species of Automation," is found in a journal called Marxism and Sciences, and it's a pretty new one. And as I said, I think it's a little longish, but we're going to try and plow through this, and not necessarily that we get to the answer, although it is sort of trying to approach the problem, particularly of current issues like AI. So here's the abstract. Devin Wangert, "Capitalism as a Species of Automation." For many decades, full automation has been treated as a possible outcome arising from the incessant transformation of the world's labor processes. The recent massification of ChatGPT and generative AI technologies has exacerbated the speculative tendency to move freely between the sense that this future is possible, on the one hand, and that it is proximate, on the other. Increasing confidence that this impending trajectory is already secured has incited both popular literature and funding round proposals that put dates and concrete numbers on the temporal distance between our present and its fully automated future. While many critics have noted that full automation is not a new idea, what is more crucial is that its earlier precedents did not belong exclusively or even primarily to science fiction. The genuine belief that full automation was and now is right around the corner is not new either. In "Capitalism as a Species of Automation," I study how, this is Devin, he studies how and why the notion of full automation has become a recurrent threshold state used to periodize the collective presence, plural, of capitalist development. Now, the question is, what if full automation has always haunted capitalism's proximate futures because automation is itself an anachronism? In this article, he contends that while full automation appears as a technical antagonism that repeatedly restages the replacement of human labor, it relates to capitalist development as a temporal antagonism, defining the replacement of technology by technology. In demonstrating how the contradictions internal to capitalist development come to be reformulated as temporal dynamics animating technological development, he focalizes automation as a privileged interpretant of the mechanism through which capitalism accumulates and disaccumulates value. Number one, or we begin, enduring automation, sites of automation, and automotive. I know it'll look like automotive, but it's automotive technologies have become seductive metonyms for what is contemporary about the contemporary moment. The affordances and properties of these technologies have been used as prominent signifiers defining the boundaries inherent to our periodizations of capitalism. If, for example, the automation of motor functions delimited late 19th and 20th century capitalism from its preceding epochs, the automation of mental labor seems now to delimit the early 21st century. Accordingly, one popular interpretation of automation's relationship to capitalism today is the notion that the world's labor processes are on the precipice of full automation, that AI and machine learning technologies now herald the accumulative possibility of automating in real time the mental processes that can be made to control automated manual processes. Now, if what seems to determine the contemporary qua contemporary is this threshold state of full automation, the term spatial logic implies that automation itself is not a unique determinant of 21st century capitalism. Full automation implies a progressive, albeit not necessarily continuous, logic in which a greater and greater amount of territory in the labor process is subsumed by automative technologies. Indeed, it is understandable as a threshold state because it defines itself against a limit after which there will be no further site or type of labor to automate. As Matteo Pasquinelli notes in The Eye of the Master, this does not necessarily imply that subsumption is synonymous with labor replacement, but it does lead to a notion of spatial conquest in which AI can be interpreted as the culmination of the long evolution of labor automation and quantification of society. If full automation is a metonym for the contemporary, it is because it appears to realize and fulfill a process of automation that began centuries ago. Crossing this threshold would ostensibly see the long evolution of labor automation henceforth be what it was always becoming. However, there are two reasons that any historiography of a contemporary defined by full automation must remain in the hypothetical. The first reason is that full automation has not yet happened. The second is that, more crucially, the threshold state of full automation, and not simply automation itself, has had 2 centuries of historical precedence. Summarizing the long history of what he terms automation discourse, Aaron Benanov observes the following in his book, Automation and the Future of Work. Automation may become a constant feature of capitalist societies. The same is not true of the theory of a coming age of automation, which extrapolates from instances of technological change to a broader account of social transformation. On the contrary, its recurrence in modern history has been periodic. Excitement about a coming age of automation can be traced back to at least the mid-19th century with the publication of Charles Babbage's On the Economy of Machinery and Manufactures in 1832, John Adolphus Etzler's The Paradise Within the Reach of All Men Without Labor in 1833, and Andrew Urra's The Philosophy of Manufacturers in 1835. These books presaged the imminent emergence of largely or fully automated factories run with minimal or merely supervisory human labor. Their vision was a major influence on Marx, whose Capital argued that a complex world of interacting machines was in the process of displacing human labor from the center of economic life. Now, visions of automated factories appeared again in the 1930s, 50s, and 80s before re-emerging in the 1910s. Each time they were accompanied or shortly followed by predictions of a coming age of catastrophic unemployment and social breakdown. The corpus that Benanov has assembled does not tell the story of a simple dialectic of forgetting and remembering that has characterized theories of social transformation accompanying the development of automotive technology since the 19th century. Rather, what he indicates is a more profound iterativity whereby the signal precedent of full automation is that in each and every epoch that it emerges as unprecedented. Paradoxically, because each of these epochs shares an image of full automation rather than more automation as a precedent, they each appear as unique and unprecedented within the history of capitalist development. It is precisely this factor that makes automation an easy metonym not only for our contemporary, but for the contemporary in aggregate. In 1832, society finds itself on a threshold after which the evolution of labor automation will finally culminate a process that had heretofore been becoming. In 1930, society finds itself on a threshold after which the evolution of labor automation will finally culminate a process it had heretofore been becoming. In our contemporary moment, society finds itself, etc., etc. Are these past precipices of full automation wrong? And is our present AI-driven precipice right? Conversely, should the repetition of these claims within an archive that can only be right once, if at all, lead us to moderate our emphasis on the exceptional character of this present? Are these questions about full automation ultimately decidable from within a linear framework of progressive automation? If they are not, this might reveal something about automation itself, and not only our collective trouble with correctly periodizing its development and theorizing its social implications. What interests him here is that the iterativity of this process describes the return not only of the specter of full automation, but its cumulative relation to a process of past automation, which it is on the precipice of fulfilling. A seemingly intuitive proposition about the progressive automation of the world's labor processes has as its verso a subsumptive proposition which holds that automation is, each and every time it reemerges, the full automation of those labor processes. Put differently, because a given contemporary moment, that is 1930, 1950, 2025, is subsumptive in relation to each epoch it succeeds, the preceding epochs must be treated as interim states. Now, because each of these epochs, now treated as interim states, likewise originally understood itself to be in the position of a final subsumptive relation with regards to the epochs it succeeded, these claims have an inbuilt corrective mechanism. Thought synthetically, this corrective mechanism leads to a polemical outcome. Each claim must be simultaneously reperiodize the past by reiterating the exceptional subsumptive character of the present, which will itself be open to the same corrective mechanism as the interim coordinates of a future epoch. It follows that subsumption is not, as common sense might tell us, the terminus of progressive automation. It rather operates according to an iterative logic that violates the logic of progressive automation, even as it both concludes and incites it. As a limit state, the subsumption implied by full automation is both final and mobile. The relationship between the historical development of capitalism and the historical development of automative technologies under capitalism thus becomes a problem for thought. To the extent that the progressive history of labor automation is actually derived from the repeated restaging of labor's full automation, this coupling can only result in a contradiction which seems to prohibit recourse to that same linear accumulative mode of development posited by the long history of labor automation. His general intervention in this article is to argue that this temporal contradiction between progressive automation and full automation does not need a resolution. It should be treated as a real, enduring contradiction that has been and continues to be born across the stages of capitalist development. To that end, I explore how and why automation becomes a unique site of semantic and historiographical confusion and correction within the historical span of capitalism. I argue that an analysis of this historiographical dynamic demonstrates that automation itself must be understood as an anachronism, a problem of time specific to the mode of development of capitalism. What appears like a polemical struggle over the periodization of a perpetually coming age of full automation is, when read cumulatively, an index of the temporal register proper to automation operations and their technological development within a capitalist mode of production. In using this temporal problem to formalize the relationship between the historical development of automation and the historical development of capitalism, I sustain 5 main theses across this article. Number 1 is the incessant restaging of full automation is a necessary outcome of the role that automotive is a necessary outcome of the role that automotive technologies play as vehicles for the accumulation. Number two, this structural linkage between the historical development of automotive technologies and the process of capitalist accumulation means that the primary dynamic of automation is not the eventual replacement of labor by technology, but the perpetual replacement of technology by technology. Number three, this dynamic effectively depends on restaging the disappearance of labor without actually eliminating labor, because it uses labor as a metric for evaluating the performance of distinctive automotive technologies as vehicles for accumulation of value. Number four, the perpetual replacement of technology by technology defines an iterative trajectory of capitalist development in which capitalism must restage the process through which it finally but repeatedly realizes itself in successive forms of technological development. And number five, we can consequently read the continual reiteration of the question of the full automation of labor as a cipher through which capitalism constantly restages its own accumulative dynamics. He treats the long history of labor automation through which what he calls a media theory of labor. Now, that's, of course, going to be problematic. Instead of beginning from the supposition that automotive technologies have innate technological properties that render them as obvious functional equivalents of human labor, and instead of supposing that these properties eventually accumulate so that there are or will be technological equivalents for all sites of human labor, he proposes that the work done by a given automotive technology is an outcome to be explained rather than an analytic point of departure. In his conception, what automation actually does in the production process would thus be the outcome of a temporal contradiction linking the historical development of capitalism to technological development under capitalism. For this reason, he does not introduce an operative technological definition for automation, the idea, for example, that an automotive technology is distinguished from other technologies because the former has a technological property that allows it to move by itself or work by itself. Instead, he derives what automation actually does, or does not do, from its linkage to the temporal organization of capitalist development. As we will see, when capitalist development seems to move by itself, that is precisely when the technologies of the production process come to work by themselves. As a temporal contradiction, automation thus interlocks two critical desires: a desire within Marxist political economy to periodize the difference made by contemporary capitalism, and a desire within media philosophy to formulate automotive operations as performances of technological labor. If he's correct that automotive labor or work is the product of a mode of time rather than an intrinsic technological property, then the problem of full automation is not decidable on the basis of the idea that past epochs which understood themselves as tending toward full automation were incorrect because they were eventually found to be lacking a technological property that was introduced into labor processes in subsequent epochs. Now, what stopped the automated factories of the 1930s from being fully automotive was not a lack of AI technologies. To that end, an anachronistic temporal operation describes the condition for actually existing automation, not a speculative future domain of automation. If what automotive technologies actually do in the present is derived from the iterative introduction of further threshold states of full automation in the future, then further automation does not automate out as a last reminder, but recapitulates it anew. Now, why should the anachronism he is describing, come to define automation itself? Doesn't what he's noted thus far demonstrate that we have repeatedly misinterpreted the future? After all, we tend to do that. The second section of this piece turns to a tension inherent in Karl Marx's own understanding of the relationship between automotive technologies and capitalist development. He does this to demonstrate that this problem of time is encoded in capitalism's developmental logic, animating its future elaboration. Now, where Marx originally understood the accumulation of automotive technologies to represent a crisis for capitalism, as a system of production based on and measured by human labor. By the time of the publication of Capital, he resolves this crisis through the concept of real subsumption. This concept centralizes the perpetual replacement of technology by technology over and above the potential replacement of labor by technology. This shift in emphasis also entails that Marx interpret automotive technologies as vehicles for the accumulation of value under capitalism, thus creating a structural linkage between the development of automotive technologies and the development of capitalism. He will show how it is precisely Marx's transformation of this perspective crisis into a perpetual process of replacement that entrenches automation as a real problem of time within the arc of capitalist development. In the subsequent sections of this piece, he will study how the legacy of this temporal contradiction, already authorized and incited by Marx's own formalization of real subsumption, as opposed to formal subsumption, is endured across an archive of attempts to periodize real subsumption according to automotive technologies in the time after Marx. Methodologically speaking, this polemic becomes more than a polemic when read in aggregate. This archive is valuable because it shows something cumulatively that its theorists do not describe individually. He therefore centralizes a reception history that has been left to work out the legacy of this transformation of the crisis of fixed capital between the Grundrisse and capital, not because he's primarily interested in who's right and who is wrong. Rather, he uses this archive as an archaeological optic on both automotive operations and the development of automotive technologies under capitalism. He'll demonstrate how this archive of misreadings and rereadings forms a protocol that seems to duplicate or perform on an intra and paratextual level the anachronistic operations proper to the capitalist conception of automation on a technological level. This archive does so by perpetually reperiodizing capital's real subsumption and perpetually disinterring Marx's fragment on machines as an explanatory optic on the contemporary, defining virtually every decade since the 1940s. In other words, he tracks the repeated reperiodizing of the epoch of real subsumption, not because he believes a correct periodization of real subsumption should be synonymous with full automation. Rather, he'll demonstrate how the historiographical treatment of real subsumption can be a register tracking the relationship between the development of automotive technologies and the historical development of capitalism. He organizes and distinguishes two orientations towards the problem of real subsumption's iterativity through two main arcs that structure the remainder of the article. The first set of readers, who he will come to call cyclists, believe that real subsumption is a concrete stage in the development of capitalism that is directly but perpetually in front of us, one that defines the contemporary of capitalism. The second set of readers, who I will come to call secularists, believe that real subsumption was a concrete stage in the development of capitalism that is now behind us. As he will demonstrate, the stakes around which position is correct, that is, in front or behind, are more primarily the stakes of two different orientations towards the iterativity of real subsumption itself, responses to the anachronism of the concept. His first arc formalizes automation's relationship to this mechanism of correction and recapitulation that haunts the legacy of real subsumption. As he'll demonstrate, Marxisms may not be interested in the iterativity of real subsumption, but is interested in them such that the very desire to displace this iterativity only entrenches it. Reading across the cyclist stratum of this archive demonstrate how the critique of real subsumption inherits the temporal pathology of that concept. Each critique of the concept becomes synonymous with its recapitulation, predicated as they are on one another, finally correct periodization of capitalism based on another finally correct reading of real subsumption, which is itself based on another finally just disinterment and Contemporization of Marx's Fragment article, chapter. I call this dynamic, he calls this dynamic, which couples the repeated finality of critique with the disinterment and contemporization of Marx's Fragment, the realer, not more real, but realer subsumption. He uses this arc to support two theses. First, he argues that the technological properties used to specify each period of real subsumption are, in fact, derived from the anachronistic logic of automation's technological development. Second, I demonstrate how the notion of progressive automation, the idea that more and more sites of labor are automated under capitalism, actually defers a terminus after which there would be no labor to automate. He argues that it does this not because real subsumption resolves the question of the disappearance of labor, but rather because it is driven by a more primary iterative mechanism that constantly restages labor's disappearance. His second arc looks at recent attempts to critique not real subsumption, but the mechanism behind its successive correction and recapitulation. Aaron Benanov and Nathan Brown propose cogent versions of the solution by which there are empirically incorrect Marxisms that are analytically interesting because of the fleshiness of their errancy, what they tell us about culture and erring. And finally, correct Marxisms like their own that are analytically correct because they correspond empirically to the actual historical development of capitalism and the actual processes of production that occur today. In this situation, the cyclists, those undergoing critique, those read for the unconscious cultural uptake of situations they consciously misrecognize, are interpolated as cultural Marxists. While the latter, those critiquing, those reading for the historical empirical data that will let them correctly recognize capitalism's secular development, could be called secularist Marxists. Brown uses the secular as shorthand for an approach that grants explanatory priority to capital's totalizing structural dynamics, periodizing capitalist development on the basis of how these dynamics or tendencies temporarily crystallize into specific structural coordinates. The cyclist, from the secularist point of view, mistakes cyclical epiphenomena such as the expansion of markets or periodic shifts of supply and demand for secular structural coordinates. This distinction allows the secularist to simultaneously graft cyclist Marxisms onto cyclical trends within the development of capitalism and monopolize explanatory license over the linear thrust of capitalism's secular development, which Brown formulates as capitalism's secular dynamics of accumulation. In this way, they really do get close to the realist real subsumption, and they do this by periodizing it in such a way that it has, one, already happened globally and secularly, and has, even more crucially, number two, ceased to happen by now, only happening locally and cyclically. In maintaining that real subsumption is behind us, the secularists would thus indirectly challenge his primary methodological proposition that the iterativity of the concept of real subsumption indexes the temporal logic of automation under capitalism. If the cyclicus are errant readers of real subsumption, does this not demonstrate that the anachronism he tracks in this article is proper to the application of the concept of real subsumption, but not proper to real automative operations or the development of automation technologies that real subsumption is continually used to periodize? Indeed, with the exception of Benanov, the majority of the secularist correctives I treat here have no overt interest in critiquing automation. Rather, what they respond to is the following question. If real subsumption describes the threshold after which capitalism properly becomes itself, how could we conceive of an epoch after? In maintaining that real subsumption is behind us, the secularists must recapitulate a periodizing gesture by which another phase, alternately named the long downturn, the stationary state, stagnation, devalorization, and so forth, explains how capitalism can fundamentally change itself in ceasing to be a regime of real subsumption par excellence without ceasing to be itself, without ceasing to be capitalism. What he argues in this arc is that the same factors which the secularists use to demonstrate that we have moved beyond real subsumption cause them to inadvertently conceive of the epoch after in terms of automation's anachronistic temporal dynamics, even as and precisely because they are trying to periodize the present according to ostensibly unrelated categories. Now, what each of these periodizing gestures has in common is the proposition that capitalism fails today by working as it always has. The secularists thus commit to showing how the accumulative mechanism used to periodize the historical ascendancy of capitalism is also the explanatory device behind the potential limits to economic growth capitalism encounters today, its progressive perspective, stagnation, and its tendency to disaccumulate already created value. In this arc, he argues that if Marx resolves the crisis of fixed capital by reconceptualizing as an asset, enabling the ascendancy and expansion of capitalism, then the way in which this legacy is born in the contemporary moment shows us how automation can be considered both as an optic on the temporal iterativity of disaccumulation, as well as a major stage on which the real process of economic disaccumulation actually plays out. Today, disaccumulation describes the temporal mechanism through which the technologies of the production process can be literally said to be automative. In tracking two opposing orientations towards the temporal contradiction thrown off by Marx's sublimation of the crisis of fixed capital, what he ultimately aims to demonstrate is an involuntary point of consensus. When these theorists are explicitly speaking about automation, or when they are inadvertently speaking about automation while trying to periodize capitalism according to ostensibly unrelated categories, they are speaking about automation as a problem of time, proper to the dynamics of capitalist disaccumulation. When these theorists are talking about what automative technologies actually do or how they operate in the present, they are talking about a technological property that is effectively derived from this same problem of time. Marx's displacement of the crisis of fixed capital ensures that whenever we're thinking capitalism's past, present, or future, we are thinking about automation all the time. Number two, crisis and chronology, capitalism as a species of automation. The frequency with which we understand change to capitalism as technological change renders the notion of full automation as a problematically intuitive idea that needs no further recourse to structural or schematic elaboration. Conversely, and counterintuitively, the mechanism behind our 2 centuries of unprecedented precedents of full automation, that is, the cumulative anachronism of this notion, only makes sense as a product of the structural relation between the development of capitalism and the development of technology. This section turns to the problem of automation as it is formalized in the 10 years between Marx's writing of the so-called fragment of machines in the Grundrisse and the concept of real subsumption in the publication of Capital. Where Marx originally understood the accumulation of automative technologies to herald an eventual crisis of capitalism due to its decentralization of human labor, he comes to sublimate that crisis by understanding the accumulation of automative technologies as a vehicle for the accumulation of value under capitalism, a process through which capitalism effectively becomes itself. In this section, he'll show that it is precisely Marx's own solution to the accumulation of automative technologies that enables and incites the constant restaging of the threshold state of full automation. Already in the Grundrisse, Marx intuited that a proposition about how machinery, as distinct from simple tools, actually works in a present production process was a synthetic proposition that linked the arcs of capitalism's historical development and the technological development of automation. In the so-called fragment on machines, where he has frequently been interpreted as offering speculative remarks on a coming age of automation, Marx notes, the production process has ceased to be a labor process in the sense of a process dominated by labor as its governing unity. Labor appears, rather, merely as a conscious organ scattered among the individual living workers at numerous points of the mechanical system, subsumed under the total process of the machinery itself, as itself only a link of the system whose unity exists not in the living workers, but rather in the living active machinery, which confronts his individual insignificant doings as a mighty organism. In machinery, objectified labor confronts living labor within the labor process itself as the power which rules it, a power which, as the appropriation of living labor, is the form of capital. Marx thus narrates what this present production process actually does. That is how it operates on the basis of the form of capital that it has historically come to embody. Marx continues, quote, machinery appears then as the most adequate form of fixed capital, and fixed capital, insofar as capital's relations with itself are concerned, appears as the most adequate form of capital as such. Unquote. Automative technologies make a difference to capitalism's present production process because they appear to realize, some centuries after the origin of capitalist development, the form of capital and systematization of the labor process most adequate to capitalism. These technologies thus double as determinants of present production processes and interpretants which read the stratigraphy of capitalist development as technological development. For Marx, there are two signal differences between machinery and simple tools. The first is the fact that machinery actively reshaped the forms of labor involved in the production process. Early capitalism proceeded according to a process of proletarianization and enclosure, which created an ever-growing population of subjects who were required to pay to live and who had no means of satisfying the discipline of payments outside of selling their own labor. In appropriating already extant forms of labor and reorienting them towards market-based production, it left those forms of labor largely intact. To that end, the introduction of machinery radically intervened in the form and content of labor processes themselves, altering them in ways that did not have clear precedents prior to the development of capitalism. The second difference has to do with the diminishing role of those subjects who must sell their labor to satisfy the discipline of payments. In machinery, objectified labor material confronts living labor as a ruling power and as an active subsumption of the latter under itself, not only by appropriating it, but in the real production process itself. The relation of capital as value, which appropriates value-creating activity, is in fixed capital existing as machinery. Posited at the same time as the relation of the use value of capital to the use value of labor capacity. Further, the value objectified in machinery appears as a presupposition against which the value-creating power of the individual labor capacity is an infinitesimal vanishing magnitude. As is well known, Marx's theory of labor theory of value is predicated on the argument that the production of surplus value is explained by a mechanism that leverages the difference that exists between how much value an hourly wage can purchase and how much value an hour of labor time creates. In other words, in order to satisfy the discipline of payments, the worker exchanges his or her labor power over a given quantity of time for wage, while only a fraction of the quantity of time actually worked. What Marx calls necessary labor is required to reproduce the capital initially outlaid for the wage payment. The remaining hours worked after this outlay is recouped are value added, what Marx calls surplus labor that is captured by the capitalist. And Marx thus comes to define capitalism against other forms of social and economic organization by way of the mechanism through which labor time is linked to the production of profit. This definition is why Pasquinelli is able to succinctly summarize the qualitative shift that emerges in the initially quantitative adjustment of the ratio of capital outlaid on machinery, what Marx calls fixed capital versus human labor, as a crisis of capitalism due to the crisis of the centrality of labor and therefore of the labor theory of value. But what precisely are the coordinates of the crisis brought on by the accumulation of machinery? Marx continues, capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as sole measure and source of wealth. Hence, it diminishes labor time in the necessary form so as to increase it in the superfluous form, hence posits the superfluous in growing measure as a condition that a question of life or death for the necessary. On the one side, then, it calls to life all the powers of science and of nature, as of social combination and of social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent, relatively, of the labor time employed on it. On the other side, it wants to use labor time as the measuring rod for the giant social forces thereby created, and to confine them within the limits required to maintain the already created value as value. Forces of production and social relations, two different sides of the development of the social individual, appear to capitalists mere means, and are merely means for it to produce on its limited foundation. In fact, however, they are the material conditions to blow this foundation sky high. Unquote. As I will explore in the third section of this article, as he will explore, this passage of Marx's so-called fragment has received extensive and successive theoretical treatment in almost every decade since the Grundriss's publication in 1941, resulting in often incommensurable theoretical conclusions. Marx claims that the contradiction in question is the exchange of living labor for objectified labor, i.e., the positing of social labor in the form of the contradiction of capital and wage labor. Does the crisis occur because of the fact that the relative magnitudes of capital outlaid on human labor and machinery now have a difference that is exponential? If labor time remains the sole measure of the creation of wealth, then the crisis would be the fact that the measuring stick used has become infinitesimal in relation to the object it is attempting to measure, like attempting to measure a skyscraper with a hand ruler. What if the measure itself had not only become infinitesimal, but was now vanishing? Marx notes that the machinery inserts itself to replace labor only when there is an overflow of labor powers. It enters not only to replace labor power where this is lacking, but rather in order to reduce massively available labor power to its necessary measure. Unquote. Here, the crisis would rather be that the creation of wealth, now relatively independent of labor time, would cross a threshold after which labor time would be irrelevant. In this account, machinery turns what was formerly necessary labor into excess labor, workers without work who could only be reabsorbed by capitalism and reemployed if production was capable of expanding. Given that further investment in production would be predicated on expectations of satisfactory demand for the goods produced, and given that the massively available labor power machinery had already rendered superfluous would have no income to support increased demand, the crisis of the accumulation of fixed capital could be read as an absolute limit to expansion, a falling rate of profit that would lower the price of goods without generating more wealth. This popular interpretation of Marx's fragment hinges on reading the conjunction infinitesimal, vanishing, literally and linearly. The infinitesimal status of living labor is, in this logic, what indicates what is now vanishing and eventually will have vanished. It thus becomes the site of projection for two contradictory reception theories which both interpret Marx as writing a prophetic passage in the Grundrisse that seems to ultimately contradict the labor theory of value. The utopian interpretation understands Marx as saying that capitalism will drive technological development to the point that will eventually automate itself out, creating a form of post-scarcity socialism where a minimal amount of necessary labor would be sufficient to sustain humanity while transmuting surplus labor into free time that could be exercised how one sees fit. The dystopian interpretation understands Marx as saying that capitalism will drive technological development to the point that it will eventually automate the bulk of the world's working populations out while still enforcing the discipline of payments on those subjects, creating a world of work done without workers and a growing population who must pay to live but have no capacity to generate means of payment. What is striking is that these antimonious readings are derived from the same point of consensus, that technological development will eventually pass a threshold after which capitalism will cease to be capitalism, either by violating its surplus producing principle or by displacing labor as the producer of surplus value. Between the writing of this fragment in 1857 and the publication of Capital in 1867, scholars of Marx Scholars of Marx have remarked that this sense that the accumulation of automotive technologies will necessarily reach a threshold after which capitalism will cease to be capitalism largely disappears from the theory. Indeed, when Marx introduces the concept of real subsumption in capital to describe the process of accumulation of automotive technologies analogous to the one glossed in his fragment, he understands it as a modality proper to capitalism, not the forebearer of its downfall. He now discusses how Marx's resolution of this crisis transforms the accumulation of automotive technologies into a temporal problem. In his article, The Capitalist Use of Machinery, Marx versus the Objectivists, Raniero Panzieri formalizes the impetus through which capitalism necessarily arrives at the stage of real subsumption by noting that technological progress itself thus appears as the mode of existence of capital as its development. That Panzieri was, like Marx, effectively attempting to offer a single, synthetic proposition about present automotive operations and the historical development of automotive technologies under capitalism is evident from his formulation, which defines what capitalism is, its mode of existence, by what it was and will be, that is, technological progress. This synthetic principle not only implies that capitalism can be used as a register to understand the development of automotive technologies. Rather, in understanding capitalism as a mode of existence defined by an impetus to realize the technological composition specific to it, Panzieri comes to posit capitalism itself as a species of automation which exists prior to, actively incites the development of, and is finally fulfilled in automotive technologies. The circularity of Panzieri's phrase, mode of existence equals development, narrates real subsumption as a process of self-realization in which capitalism must become what it is, in which the automotive development of capitalism fulfills itself in automotive technologies. Now, does this entail that capitalism's self-realization is also the realization of full automation? Marx and his contemporaries often spoke metaphorically about capitalism as a gigantic machine, is Panzieri reiterating this metaphor once more. Wingard shows how this interpretation of capitalism itself as a species of automation that necessarily tends towards a greater and greater expansion of automotive technologies is rather inherent to how the prospective crisis of fixed capital that Marx wrote about in Grundrisse is sublimated by the concept of relative surplus value in capital. By sublimated, I mean that the contradiction animating this crisis is transformed. It no longer appears as a crisis of fixed capital accumulation, but is not overcome. While there is in Marx's fragment an empirical propensity towards the accumulation of machinery, there is not yet a structural mechanism that explains why this must be the case. Capitalism could tend towards the development of automotive technologies, and these technologies might realize a specific organization of labor that did not exist prior to capitalism. But this dynamic was not understood to be self-realizing. Likewise, the specter of overproduction already discussed seemed to present an absolute limit to the benefits derived from an expansion of automotive technologies, which might even make such a trajectory undesirable. Marx's concept of relative surplus value addressed the crisis of fixed capital by reimagining the relation between technology and labor in terms of what are now called productivity gradients. As Pasquinelli summarizes it, real subsumption employs the concept of relative surplus value to critique Marx's earlier notion of crisis in the fragment, positing that surplus value can be augmented not just by reducing wages and material costs, but also by increasing the productivity of labor in general. Investment in technology would provide a capitalist with the possibility of selling goods at the prevailing price while also decreasing the overall cost of production, since it would decrease the quantity of labor required to produce those goods. Marx saw that technological development thus opened up the possibility for the relative capture of surplus value before intra-capitalist competition would eventually lower the price of goods in question. As Robert Meister notes in Justice is an Option, while this reformulation ostensibly resolves one facet of the crisis of fixed capital, since it explains how the accumulation of machinery can continue to generate wealth, while indirectly lowering the price of goods, it does so by entrenching the accumulation of automotive technologies as a structural dynamic of capitalist accumulation. That is, producer goods, new machinery, and raw materials become core vehicles for preserving and accumulating surplus value by allowing investors to benefit from the arbitrage opportunities that are opened by the steeper productivity gradients that relative surplus value reflects. Because of its need to accumulate previously created surplus value by investing its producer goods, industrial capitalism simultaneously commits itself to constantly expanding production. Now, if the notion that capitalism preserves its past gains through future-oriented investment in machinery leads to the proposition that capitalism itself is a species of automation, why should real subsumption not eventually come to mean full automation? How does the concept of relative surplus value sustain both the logic of progressive automation, as we now see above, and the iterativity of the subsumptive limit of full automation? Because Marx understands the creation of relative surplus value to be predicated on the capture of the value thrown off by the spread between different costs of production of a given commodity that would be sold for the same price, a spread that will eventually close when intra-capitalist competition causes the entire industry to adopt a more productive method of production. The fragments problem, that is the fragment of machines text, problem of the replacement of human labor by technology is both systematically attached to and made secondary to the problem of the replacement of technology by technology. Relative surplus value reinterprets the infinitesimal magnitude of living labor, not according to the integral definition of a very small magnitude that could one day be removed. Rather, it's likely that Marx implicitly understood infinitesimal in a directional derivative sense as a function that is perpetually tending towards a limit of zero without ever reaching that limit. In this logic, living labor is both progressively and perpetually vanishing without arriving at a terminus after which it will have actually vanished. Labor's tendential relation to this limit is precisely why it could become a measure of the difference in possible spreads between productivity gradients that could be opened up by the replacement of technology with technology, which is the tacit condition for the capture of relative surplus value in the first place. Put differently, human labor can measure the spread in productivity of two or more different technologies used to produce a commodity sold at the same price because each combination will yield a different position of that magnitude of labor relative to zero. In placing these productivity gradients on a continuum where they can be compared against each other, that is a spread, human labor is treated as an infinitesimal measure or directional derivative that tends towards zero. Conversely, if human labor was treated as an integer, zero, the measurement would become undefined and could no longer compare the possible spreads between productivity gradients, which informs the replacement of technology by technology. Relative surplus value implies that living labor could only function as a measure for productivity gradients to the extent that it is retained, of course. But what we see here is that it is retained as vanishing, because the replacement of technology with technology is essentially based on investment and thus the outward expansion of capitalism. This internal limit which living labor tends toward is, as Deleuze and Guattari have argued, perpetually displaced. In this way, the sublimation of the problem of labor replacement itself creates the possibility of repeatedly revisiting that problem in new and successive epochs. It does so by repeatedly restaging the moving limit against which living labor is an infinitesimal vanishing magnitude. Labor is perpetually disappearing again and for the first time. Now, I know that that's a little hard to follow, but it puts us in an interesting place, and I'm going to stop now because there's a whole other set of sections, three more sections of yammering like this, and maybe we'll try to do this tomorrow. But you can read this perhaps for yourself. But it is important to think about that while automation is bound up with the question of labor replacement, we can see now that the same substantive logic, which incites us to think about automation as an explanatory mechanism behind the disappearance of labor, is paradoxically the logic that renders an integral linear understanding of labor's eventual disappearance as an insufficient explanatory device to conceptualize the relationship between technological development and the historical development of capitalism. So I'll leave you with that paradox because it is somewhat of a paradox. Uh, and it doesn't mean that that it'll it's Skynet and the Terminators, but it does raise an interesting kind of question that's worth pursuing further. I've exceeded my usual time, and so I'll stop there. Let's see if there are any comments. No, there are no comments. Thank goodness. Let me stop share and stop the live stream. Thank you very much for your attention. What I've been reading today is a Devin Wingert's article, Capitalism as a Species of Automation, Devin Wangert, and it is from Marxism and Sciences.